right, we will get started. Welcome everybody to day 2 of the Ann Lister Summit. I hope you all had a great first day, and thank you so much for coming in at this kind of odd time for a lot of you. We really appreciate you guys getting up early or staying up late. We are coming to you from Australia, so that's the reason for the odd timing. So we definitely appreciate you guys checking in. So I'm Jenna, if you haven't seen my face before, and I have been working on the transcription project, and I'm living in Sydney, and so I'm helping with facilitating this session. And we are very lucky to have with us today Dannielle Orr, and she completed her doctoral thesis about Anne at Murdoch University in Western Australia in 2006. So welcome, Dannielle. Thank you so much for talking to us today. We definitely appreciate your time. So do you want to just kind of introduce yourself, tell us what you're doing?
Yep. Thanks, Jenna. Yes, thanks to everybody coming. It's interesting to see the chat where everybody's coming from. We tried to find a time that was suitable for everyone, so thanks for joining us on Australian time. Yeah, as Jenna said, I finished my doctoral thesis on Anne in Western Australia, and it was about 13 years ago now, which is a lucky number for me, which is kind of bizarre because 13 is not usually a lucky number. But I was reminiscing about it and realised that, as an odd fact, you know, that when I started, homosexuality was still a crime in Western Australia when I began my thesis in the late 90s. Tasmania and Western Australia hadn't abided by the Charter of Human Rights, and they still had a criminal homosexuality act. So, you know, doing a thesis on a dead lesbian was really racy, criminal stuff, you know. And I had to pass ethics reviews and jump all these hoops. So, you know, it was kind of an interesting time. Fortunately, they repealed it shortly thereafter, but yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't know it was still illegal at the time. So yeah. Considering that, how did you learn about Ann Lister?
Yeah, I find it really interesting, you know, this idea of everybody coming to her from the TV series, because I suppose in some ways my path was very similar. I came to her from the books, and at the time it was Helena Whitbread's diaries, because Jill Lennington had only published a couple of papers at that stage. She published the book while I was in my honours year, I think it was. But I came to her at a great course that was called Duchesses and Drudges, and it was all about women's history in 18 and 1900s. And there was 1 week on Anne, and we had to read her diaries. And I just thought, this woman who writes about eating grapes and her bowel movements is just like, what's that? You know, it was just really interesting. And I was coming out at the time. So there was a lot of parallels between my life and Anne's life. And I just, like, she wore these dramatic black clothes, and I was really into, you know, dramatic black clothes. And I was in my 20s, and Anne, the start of Whitbread's books, Anne was in her 20s. You know, she was already well experienced, perhaps you could say, or you know, she'd fallen in love with women a lot and was searching to name herself and understand her sexuality. And I was sort of going through a very similar process. And she liked walking, I liked walking, she liked reading, I liked reading, and the only thing I really couldn't relate to at all was the writing. And I was like, what is it about this woman that she just writes so obsessively? And that was it. That's how it started.
Yeah, it's always interesting how everyone relates to her. She's such a multifaceted person. Everyone can find ways to relate. So once you learned about her, what made you decide to go all the way through doing a PhD on Anne?
Yeah, I think once I kind of found her, then she kind of took over my life.
She does that.
It was kind of like, I can't leave this woman alone. She just, and so I had that 1 week with her. Then my partner then at the time, you know, she was from Western Australia, so we moved back to Western Australia. As I said, it was criminal. I was at the university there. I met one of the lecturers who said, yeah, you can just pick a topic and you can design a course around your own topic. And I'm like, I'm really interested in this woman. She writes, she just writes obsessively. So she goes, yeah, right, I do a course on her. And I'm like, okay. So I designed, it was called an independent study contract. I designed that all around Anne. I read all of Whitbread, I read all of Muriel Green, I read everything of Liddington's, basically read everything I could get my hands on. And out of that, I set up, you know, a topic that I could do for my honours thesis. And that was really reading through Whitbread, because the sexual Anne was the one that really interested me at that time. Reading through Whitbread for the marriage rituals that she had with M, like they had, you know, they set a time to read the same passages together. They set periods that they would meet and have anniversaries together. They wore rings. They made a promise to each other. So it was looking at all those, you know, wedding rituals, commitment rituals. And I also looked at her black clothes because, you know, that was really where I was at that time too. And I read through that to see what she was trying to symbolise by her black clothes. And from that came my paper. I tell myself to myself that, or, you know, can't remember what it's called, but that one. And then by that stage, my supervisor says, you know, you've got a PhD in this if you want to do a PhD. And I was like, I really, 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 really want to get the originals and read them and, you know, finally not have to read Anne through everybody else's filter, but read Anne for myself. I was like, I just want to do that, and it's going to cost us a fortune. And she's like, no, we'll be right. So I went up to the head librarian, who was quite used to me by that stage, coming in and out for several years, you know, 4 or 5 years, you know, banging on about Anne. And I said to him, can we buy her microfilms? And he goes, yeah, sure. And I was like, oh, great. So we bought the microfilms. They cost a bomb. I think Murdoch University was still the only university library, or any library in Australia, that still has them. I got them digitised for my study and research purposes. And then I proceeded to travel all around Australia with my partner at the time, you know, doing Anne's diaries. Yeah.
Amazing. So for the people who haven't had a chance to read your thesis yet, can you give us a brief overview of what your thesis was about? I know it's extensive, but...
Yeah, and asking me to be brief is like, you know, but I suppose working backwards, I mean, the thing I'm most proudest of is the diary, mechanics, writing, journal, symbol, all the writing work. I mean, the thing that originally got me in, but if you work backwards really from the easiest to the most complex, what I was trying to do with the sexual Anne, in a sense, is try and present another view of Anne. I really struggled with the Anne that I saw in Whitbread. I understood M had a large place in her life, and I understood she really loved M. But at the time that I was reading about it, I was venturing out onto my first, you know, like fully committed lesbian relationship. And I'm like, is this all I have in life? This sort of like one true love. And, you know, the parallels, I was like, I can't, you know, that's not life. It's more complex than that. So I was really keen to see if there was someone past M, you know, like to give her a bit of agency, to see whether she learnt from that and developed a committed, loving relationship with another woman. So that's what I was trying to do in that chapter. In the next chapter, I was trying to look at really the Jill Liddington portrait, if you like, of Anne, where it's all about social Anne, the landowner and the electoral sort of Tory member, you know, the heiress and then owner of Shibden Hall. And I was trying to say they're not separate things, you know, and sexual Anne and social Anne are the same person. But I never got that from all the different writings. And then you come to Muriel Green, who writes about Anne's letters, and you get another picture of Anne completely. You get this adventurous and cosmopolitan and warm woman who writes, you know, as Muriel Green says, flowery letters. You know, these really sentimental, affectionate, you know, warm letters. And I was like, I can't see how these are all the same people. You know, it felt like we were all talking about different Annes. So in that part of my work, in the writing mechanics part of my work, I was trying to bring all of that together and go, right, if you look at her letters, if you look at her journals, if you look at her indices, if you look at her account books, and we bring them all together, then we get a portrait of a complex Anne. And it's not, you know, this or this or this. It's this very, you know, a woman with dignity, a woman who, you know, was writing about her life and just had such honesty and, you know, touched my heart and really appealed to me, and just, you know, a sense of her as a complex woman. So that's what I tried to do.
Yeah. So to kind of accomplish that, you kind of chose to focus in on a very specific time in Anne's life. Can you talk about a little bit about why you chose the specific time that you did?
Yes. Oh, look, I would have loved to have, I really, really, really wanted to do Eliza Rain. But I sort of picked up that there wasn't much left of those writings in that period. But I had to be realistic, and you know, I knew I was going to do some transcribing, and I knew it would take time, and it ended up taking me every day of 2 years to do the 7 months that she was in Paris. But I had to pick a period that was kind of like, I needed a discrete period. I needed something that sort of had a start and sort of had an end. I mean, I know she met Maria later on the 2 years hence trip, but I needed sort of a little bubble, if you like, a little period of time where I could look at what she did in that discrete period of time. And
just
Maria,
for everyone who hasn't read it, this is when Anne was in Paris in 1824 to 25. So when she first meets Maria Barlow.
Yes. And that was because she was the first woman, really, the first serious relationship, I think, after M. And that's why I picked it. So, you know, you sort of, it's No Priest But Love. It's in that part of Whitbread's diaries. But it's sort of moving on from the M romance, if you like, and trying to be realistic and practical. And she had by then understood that she had a venereal taint. So I was interested in that aspect as well, of how she managed her sexuality with her sexual practices so that she didn't infect her lovers. And so I just had a sense, just from No Priest But Love, that there was something going on there. And so I thought, that's the period I'll look at. You know, it had a neat start. It seemed to, you know, it was 7 months. And then I could look across all the materials that she wrote for that period. But I ended up really liking Maria Barlow. I thought, you know, she sounded like a really saucy woman.
Yeah, definitely. So we know when she was in Paris on that trip, she was staying at the Place Vendôme. And can you talk a little bit about kind of how that situation that she was in really brings out the different sides of Anne's kind of sexuality and sociality and how she interacted with the people that she was living with there?
Yeah, it was really interesting because some of it, it was having had to work earlier with Whitbread's books. I was kind of used to holding lots of different pictures of Anne in my head. I was used to holding Whitbread's version of Anne, the Anne I was getting in the diaries and the journals, and then I started to realise too that there were things that I could see from the writing that Anne herself, I don't think, was aware of, which was really interesting. So, for instance, there was this. It was a bit like what is it, Room with a View? You know, the movie about the pension in Italy with Helena Bonham Carter. It's based on E.M. Forster's novel. It was a bit like that. This little world where they all were English expats together, and then these English and French gentlemen and women would come in and, you know, socialise with them, and they'd form attachments and marriages, or, you know, not wise attachments, and run away with each other and all this sort of stuff. So it was a, you know, real drama of a little world. And there were a couple of key relationships that she had there. And for a while, Maria was very much, at the start, she was very much on par with Mademoiselle de Sands as a love interest, or a potential love interest. And Mademoiselle de Sands was one of the other guests there, a French woman who was staying at Place Vendôme. And so Anne sort of had these dual interests, but then finally sort of developed more intimacy with Maria and a relationship with her. But at the same time, I could see in the background all these relationships with other men that played a role. And Mr. Franks, the Irishman, was one of them that really was quite obvious to me that he was interested in Anne, but she just didn't see it at all, like, because she wasn't interested in him. You know, it really was only obvious to her right when he was leaving, and he kind of almost sort of declared himself to her. So it was quite intriguing to then have another picture of Anne, you know, like the Anne I could see, but she wasn't quite aware of some of the situations herself, even as she wrote them, you know.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting seeing kind of the how her relationships with like Madame de Boive influenced her relationships with Maria and the other women in the house, and how she kind of navigated having to have this relationship with Maria, but also maintain her relationship with the owner of the house.
And gatekeeper. I think it really became evident that Madame was the gatekeeper of the house. Like, she was the one that gave social approval to all the relationships and chaperoned and then took them on outings. And Monsieur was totally not evident hardly at all the whole time. It was Madame who, you know, who organised and orchestrated everything. So it was really interesting how Anne did end up sort of having this rather dramatic triangle of interests with Madame and with Maria, and then that led to a real argument and you know, sort of detente, and then, you know, that was it, and Maria's reputation was besmirched, and so off they went, you know. But it was really interesting too, because, I mean, Anne wasn't sure she was going to go with Maria for a while, and then she finally decided to. And I think that's probably the first time Anne actually ever lived with someone, even though it was only, I think, from January to March in the end. But, you know, this was an independent house where Anne was living with her partner, rather than, you know, staying at Maria's house at Lawton, or I'm sorry, not Maria's house, Em's house at Lawton, or staying at the Belcombs, you know, with Em. So you know, there were a lot of things Anne did for the first time in Paris that I think were really interesting and taught her a lot, and she learned, you know, a lot from it. It was a real watershed, I felt, but not having studied right up to 1840, I don't know, but it felt like she really could learn to have a partner and have a relationship beyond Em.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So to get into kind of the other side of Anne that you looked at, and that was the author Anne, the writer Anne, the Anne who kept her journals and wrote her letters and everything. Can you just talk a little bit about the importance of writing to Anne and the role that it played in her little world?
Yeah. It was really the thing that started me off. It's the thing I'm still obsessed with, and it's the thing I'm really, like, when I look back at my work, it's the thing I'm proudest of. I'm so glad I did it. The Anne I met through her writing is this really complex, amazing woman, and her writing is just such an intricate system. And I really had no idea. I mean, I'd seen maybe a picture of her journal page, but when I finally got the microfilms and I looked at this dense thicket of, you know, plain hand and crypt hand and, you know, the indices and the letters list, and I looked at the letters, and there's a fascinating letter from that period where she crossed it, you know, so she went one way and then she turned the page and then she crossed it. I mean, you'd kind of look at this and you'd go, how am I going to transcribe all this? You know, it's going to take you forever. And like, it really dawned on me then that all of her writing really is some form of discretionary practice, because you can't just get into the plain hand. It's not easy to read. You have to kind of, and it's really small. At least on the microfilms it was, and times when she was busy or rushed or she had a lot to say, it's really tiny, and you kind of like, you know, and I was zooming and zooming and zooming, trying to see the writing and work it out. Sometimes I had to write it out myself to even try and figure out what she was saying. And I just sort of thought, this is a system, you know, like this is, it didn't happen by accident, it happened by design. And as I started through transcribing, I became aware of all the different layers sort of over that 2 years that I worked with it, and then the sort of 5 years that I wrote up what I'd done, you know. And so you sort of, you get into the plain hand, you can realise that's a bit of a system, you know, only certain people would be able to read it. And then the crypt was even more of a, you know, you had to have the crypt to be able to decrypt it. So then that's a level of audience again, and a different web of relationships again. And then I started to realise that it had a bigger purpose, or at least I say this as if I know Anne. I do in a sense, because it was like 10 years day in and day out with her for my life, you know, 24 hours a day I was dreaming about her even. But it's also just my theory. So, you know, I could be right, I could be wrong. But when you get into the indices and you start to see the intricacy of the symbols and the way she used the symbols there, then you really start to get a sense of Anne's story, or the story she was trying to tell herself. And that's when I really started to go, whoa, this is, this is really interesting. This is a whole different level again. Because it was not the day-to-day stuff of the journal entries. She was pulling out those things that she was interested in, and she was marking them to go into the index. And then you get into the index, and then she's marking them again. And she's got a classification system that she used. And it when you put all those statements together, it tells a story over that 7 months. But from what we know from her other writings, she actually read over her journals, and she looked back and read, from prior years. So then it's not just a story of 7 months that she's telling. It's the story she's trying to tell herself in 5 years or in 10 years. And that's when I started to think, right, this is her autobiographical project. This is, it's not just an account for herself. She's actually, constructing an autobiography or a story of herself for herself.
Yeah, it's very. So the process that she used that you were talking about with the symbols and the way that she kind of structured how she could look back and find the things that she found interesting. Can you kind of explain that in a little more detail? Because I know for the people who are working with transcribing the journals, if we get the indexes, it's always a bit of a, oh gosh, because it's hard. But I think I definitely, after hearing about your work, I have a whole new appreciation for just how much information those can give us through this kind of symbology that she uses. So can you kind of walk us through her system?
Well, so what I think she's doing with her, and I suppose I should briefly say how I started to piece it together. I could see she used a section mark, which is like a curly kind of S, and she put it in her margins in her journal entries. And I could see that the line or the topic that related to it in the section mark was in the margin, but the journal entry, the sentence or the crypt or part that related to it, then went into the index. And there was a day where I had done transcription, and it was something like 36 section marks. And I was like, this is, like, what? What's so important that she's indexing all of this? But when I went to the index and I looked at it, it was only a few sentences, and it didn't have 36 section marks. I'm like, it just didn't tally. But it did have like 2 section marks together. And I'm like, oh, there's something going on here. And so what I started to do was track all the single section marks. And then I started to separately track all the double ones. And then towards December, when the relationship with Maria Barlow really starts to enter like a courtship, then you start to see the triple section marks. And there's only about 12 of them for that period. But it tells, like when you linked all the subjects, it actually tells the whole story of courtship. So that's how I was able to start seeing that she did different things with them. So on the triple section mark level, she's telling us a very intense story of the courtship with Maria. The double section marks were sort of mostly the toing and froing with Mademoiselle de Sands and Maria, but they also contained sort of other information that she found interesting, like good booksellers and that sort of thing. And given, how much Anne read about her own sexuality from like classic Latin writers, and it starts to make sense that, a good bookseller would be really important. And then on the single section mark level, she's basically doing a real sociable account or a travelogue kind of account of her time in Paris. And they were, you know, you could see that too by the amount and the topic. And there was 100 and something single section marks in the index. And then there was, I can't remember how many double section marks, it was 40 or 50. And then there was only the 12 triple ones. So that's where you really start to see her own story that she's telling herself coming together. And that, you know, basically the last chapter of my thesis is that account of the triple section marks, of that, of how she felt about Maria Barlow and that relationship. But she used other signs and symbols. Like, I could go on all day about her signs and symbols.
Yeah. Well, I think it's really interesting because there are things that don't get as much attention as the other kind of pieces of, like the structure of the journals don't get as much attention in the terms of how she actually structured it. So it's definitely changed kind of what I think when I look at the journal pages. About the, as you said, she's kind of structuring this in a very sort of autobiographical sense. Can you kind of explain like what journaling meant to people in that day and like kind of why this was such a structured sort of practice for her?
Yeah, and I was really lucky too, because I think with one of the marks, she actually changed it during the period. So I could see how she did develop her practice. For me, it was really important, you know, as a lesbian myself, as a woman who was really intrigued with this historical woman who loved the fairer sex, you know, that I really pay attention to what she was saying. And that's where I really became respectful. I'm not sure I have the word. I can feel the sentiment, but I'm not sure. Yeah, respectful or amazed or in awe of her project, because her journaling was an account that she wanted to give herself or make of her life with incredible veracity and honesty and, you know, truthfulness. And she, you know, and I pieced together too how she did that. Like she had Eliza Reigns, I think it was a little red Moroccan notebook from her, and she'd draft things in there, you know, memoranda made at the moment, I think she called them. And then she would write up her journal accounts. I think she then went to write the indexes, because she often said, you know, wrote the journal of today and then the indexes in that order. But it was really, and this was another way I sort of could see how the section marks work too. It was really important when she was doing that index that she then moved back into the journal entry and edited it and corrected it and added detail. So sometimes you get, you know, lines up the margin because she's added a little bit extra in, or sometimes you get strike throughs where she's just not quite got the right word and she's corrected herself, or you get the caret insertions and she's, you know, added a little bit of extra detail. And from that sort of back and forth process, she then, you know, section marks her indexes, I think, to then say, this is a story I'm telling myself. And she, you know, it was a very deliberate process and she took a lot of time to do it. You know, like for the whole Paris period, she wrote pretty much every single day. So it was a very faithful, dedicated practice. And so it was really key for me to sort of honour that. And so one of the ways that I tried to do that too was use her language for things. So, you know, journal is her word for it. And I think that sort of, that you can then understand the reportage process and the editorial process from that word journal. And for that, you know, an account with veracity. So, you know, I always try to say journal. You know, she called it crypt hand, so I always called it crypt hand. And she called the other version of her writing plain hand, so that's what I always called it too. And just to try and understand a little bit of what it was like to journal in you know, 1800s, but also what she meant by journaling. You know, as a non-journalist myself, I was like, wow, this is just like the most amazing lifelong project, you know.
Yeah, it's very impressive. Right, well, we're coming up close to our question time, but just before we go into that, now that all of the papers have become so much more widely accessible, at least the journals and travel journals and things, is there anything in particular you would be particularly interested to research or looking into more?
I love what she did with her writing. You know, it was so complex and it's so rich, and just, you know, her, as she called it, her patient habit of referencing. You know, just I'd love to go and pay attention with patience to her other habits of referencing, and I'd love to see if how she, I mean, I'm sure, because she was so dedicated to the writing, I'm sure she kept symbols for the rest of her, you know, writing life. So I'd love to see how they changed over time, and I'd love to see what she did with them. Like I said earlier, the venereal taint symbol changed in the period, and she marked it. She marked it in the journal margin, and then she gave an explanation of how it changed in the journal entry. So I think, you know, it's this incredibly flexible system of meaning. And I'd love to see how, what did she do with that in the 1830s? What did she do with that, you know, until she died? And how rich did it become, or how dense did it become? And I'd love to see if she kept telling herself those stories. You know, did she just do the triple section marking in Paris, or were there other relationships where she you know, created and constructed and edited this account of the relationship in her indexes? I'd love to see that. I really wish she hadn't destroyed the Eliza Reign stuff. I would love to, you know, I'd love to read the Eliza Reign stuff. Yeah, I'd love to track her venereal complaint through her whole life. And something that was really evident from the Paris period was that she was very, very careful with Maria, that she, you know, we would call it safe sex practices. I think she understood how difficult, like she understood herself, how upset she was when M didn't tell her and she became infected. Like, I think that was a real blow to Anne. So and then she unwittingly passed it on to Tib. And I think with Maria, she was just so careful and, you know, such a considerate lover that, you know, and she worked out ways of having a sexual relationship with Maria that meant Maria didn't become infected. And I'd love to see what happened with that over her life too. You know, did she ever feel she was cured? Did she ever get into a system of management with it that, you know, she felt well, you know?
Yeah. Cool. Well, this has been very interesting. I'm just really interested in all of your work, especially around the structuring of the journals and the process that Anne used in creating them. But we're about to the question time now. So if anybody out there have any questions, if you want to raise your hand, and I'll ask to mute you in the little participants thing. Or if you aren't sure how to do that, you can just put it in the chat. Lynn, I can see you're physically holding up your hand. Do you have a question?
Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know how to do it on screen yet. So thank you so much, Dannielle, for your time. It's been ever so interesting and your enthusiasm is really clear still. I read your thesis much earlier this year and really enjoyed it. For anyone who hasn't read it, it was
Thank you.
very, very, very readable. I think, I mean, I haven't read any other PhD thesis yet, but I did start a friend's and it was very, very technical, very difficult. So yours was fantastic. I was lucky enough to transcribe January 1825, and that was quite eye-wateringly explicit. That was good fun. And there's also quite a bit that you can see about Anne vacillating in her feelings about Maria Barlow and Mariana. And I feel throughout Anne's relationship with Mariana, she was kind of held back by her in her relationships with others. So Anne seems to struggle between feeling, is Mrs. Barlow trying to trap me into a relationship? And on the other hand, they're very close and trusting with one another. And the question is really, after all that, do you feel that Anne was ever serious about Mrs. Barlow and a potential future together?
Oh, good question. I mean, to give Maria Barlow some agency as well, I think, you know, Maria Barlow was in a really tricky situation. She was a widow with a daughter. And, you know, obviously Mr. Hancock had been paying court to her and would offer her, you know, a home and a livelihood and an income and a position of stability. So, I mean, it was tricky. Neither Maria or Anne came without, you know, some attachment. Anne came with that attachment to M. Maria came with that possibility of having a future with Mr. Hancock. I do think Anne was serious. I think she was cautious. I think she was cautious for a number of reasons. I think she was cautious about her venereal taint. I think she was cautious because, you know, it was Paris, it was new, it was, well, I mean, she'd been before, but she'd not ever been for that long and had a relationship there as well. And I think perhaps she had such an understanding with Tib and with M that it would be really hard for a new lover or a new potential lover to come into that kind of situation and, you know, make a claim on your heart so quickly. So I don't know. I do think she was serious. Certainly the time she gave to writing about it shows her seriousness and her sense of potential that she could see in the relationship. Yeah. But yeah, I always wanted to go back and do their Italy trip, and I never got to do that either. So I'm looking forward to when that's transcribed because I want to see how it ended.
Well, I can see Patricia, you have your hand up.
This is fascinating, and I'm so excited to have the opportunity to read your dissertation now. I'm quite sure no one has ever read mine, but
I feel a bit the same.
Well, that's not going to be the case. Anyway, I wasn't quite sure if you were in a relationship yourself already when you started this work. but the context was criminalized, and your situation was potentially criminalized in Australia. What was your impression? How did you feel about, or what did you think about Anne's sexual activities, or her courting, or her success in her sexual activities, or what did you make of all that?
I think because I was coming out as a lesbian, and you know, the relationship with Anne actually pretty much timed with the relationship with my partner. So it was kind of like, you know, here's my other girlfriend, Anne. It was you know, I went through, I have no idea how it is for a lot of other people, but I went through that process of finding what I meant by lesbian and what I understood my sexuality to be. And from that, I really wanted to be very careful with Anne and how I dealt with her writings. I mean, it partly started because, you know, I had to jump through ethics committee hoops to write about, you know, to even study her. You know, I mean, the fact that she'd been dead for hundreds of years didn't matter. The fact that I was studying a criminal sexuality mattered. So, you know, I was always really careful for that reason to not identify her in a way she didn't identify herself. So she identified as a lover of the fairer sex. I think I have some understanding of that, but there are things beyond that we'll never know about her because, you know, it's a different time and place now. We live in a different time and place. So, you know, there'll always be that unknowable historical moment, you know, that we'll never really, we can try and understand Anne, but we'll never fully know, and unless we live through it like, you know, she did. But yeah, I mostly just really enjoyed it because with her I got to learn about all these sexual practices. I got to learn how many girlfriends and lovers and love interests she had, and I kind of got to mentally travel the world, and like I took it as a great excuse to read all sorts of things. And I do remember one time I was sitting, I can't remember where it was, I think it was the National Library of Australia in Canberra, which is a beautiful architectural masterpiece and sort of very stuffy kind of, you know, institution, you know, in the heart of Canberra where our government is. And I remember reading all about like 18th century and 19th century porn. And I was just like, nobody knows what I'm reading here. Like, you know, I'm reading all about, you know, whipping with birch and, you know, all sorts of sadomasochistic processes. And, and I was like, you know, thank you, Anne. So, you know, it was took me into a wide world of 1800s sexuality, which is just so fascinating. I hope that answers your question.
Oh, one quick follow-up. What do you think about the word worldly? She referred to Mary.
In that historical time.
Especially as she refers to Mariana.
Yeah, at that historical time, it does connote a sense of, you know, having knowledge that you shouldn't have, really, being, and it can imply sexual knowledge, you know, that you're too loose sexually, or that you're not chaste, or that you have too much self-interest. And within the 1800s, self-interest means it's quite a capitalized understanding of interest. It means, you know, financial and you know, looking to your livelihood and income. So, you know, worldly can connote that you know, she may be in it for a long-term you know, sugar daddy. That's to put a modern take on it. But yeah, I take worldly to mean, you know, that she didn't always trust M's feelings or motives.
Good questions. Very interesting. I can see Lucia, you have a question?
Yeah, hello. Hi, Dannielle. Thank you, first of all. To the point, it's not strictly connected about sex and the Paris, the sex in Paris, but about Maria Barlow. I've been talking with Frankie. Frankie is the girl who runs the Gentleman Jack the Last Instagram account, and she's Italian, and she's a transcriber. I mean, and she hinted me that she was really fond of the time you're talking about, the relationship with Maria Barlow, because apparently Anne told Maria many things about her youth, and so also we can now know much more about how she came to know herself in her earlier years. Can you tell us something about this? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. There were so many patterns that Anne had. She had patterns with her signs and symbols. She had patterns with her crypt writing. She had, you know, mechanical patterns with how she wrote, you know, like she wrote this way in her journal, then she turned it upside down to write that way with the indexes. Like, it's all these kind of patterns. And one of the patterns that I picked up was that she would use this phrase, you know, telling the story. And she recounted over about a month or a month and a half with Maria the story of herself, and she would preface it with, you know, telling the story. And she would say things like telling Mrs. B nearly the whole story of the affair, or, you know, of the relationship with M, or telling part of the story, you know, and through this she sort of pieced together this backwards looking, you know, account of how she got to where she was in 1824, 1825. And I mean, it's not as she lived it, because that would be the journals at that time, but it is her own account of, you know, in retrospect of that life and how she understands herself. And the one theme that came out most strongly with this telling the story was the three favourites that she had, which was clearly M and Tib, I think, and possibly Eliza, but I was never quite sure whether it was Eliza or because Eliza by that time was institutionalised and was really not someone Anne saw at all regularly or had a current relationship with. So someone has to find out who the other favourite is. But yeah, that's, you know, obviously there were three women that were really important in her life up to 1824 that helped her understand herself through knowing them as well and having relationships with them.
Very interesting. We have a couple of questions that are in the chat that I can just read out. One is just asking about where Anne would have learned the process that she used for journaling, like the indexing and the structural kind of aspects.
I think there was an indication that, like the marriage rituals with M, where they would read something at the same time at every day or every few days, there was an indication, like with the crypt that she developed with Eliza, that they maybe journaled together. so I think that's how it started. I think it became something different for Anne as she, and it, you know, I looked at a moment really in her life. It would mean different things before and after that I didn't look at. So, but she was just such a great reader. You know, she read everything. She was always walking down to the Halifax Library, you know, in her great black Byronic clothing and being very dramatic and, you know, windswept. And so I reckon, you know, she just would have had picked up a lot of that from the classics and the way, you know, the Greeks and the Latins had indexed information. The Enlightenment period, you know, was all about indexing knowledge of the world. So, you know, I think she just would have picked it up and developed it as she went and discarded what she didn't need. It's interesting when you look, I did an appendix in my journal where I actually looked at each journal volume and looked at what parts she still retained through her life. And like, she didn't always have an index, and she introduced travel memoranda in one journal, I think. So, you know, she did adapt it as she needed it to serve a purpose.
Yeah, it's cool seeing how it changes throughout her life. You also mentioned talking about how Anne used what we would call safe sex practices with Maria. Can you talk a little bit about the techniques that she used that she talks about?
Who knows? I really, I guessed in a sense a lot of that, because I mean, what does someone mean by close? It's really hard, you know. She'd say, you know, we came close. Well, does that mean you're sort of, you know, my understanding of what means close means intimate. What does that mean to someone else? So I really struggled to figure out what she meant in a lot of ways, because she didn't actually define it. It was a lot of it that I worked out was inference, just from, you know, the little snippets that she would sort of drop occasionally. But I also hesitated to be too definitive about what she was doing, because, you know, it's only true for a particular period of time. I mean, sex lives and sexuality change over time. And I really also had a academic problem with people taking modern identities like, you know, butch and femme. And Joan Nestle talked very beautifully and powerfully about this, about being femme in the 50s and how it would get, you know, moved out of time and out of context onto other identities. And, you know, and Joan Nestle has such a love of femme and being femme, and she just, you know, really has a sense of joy of life as a femme, you know, that it was, I was trying to be very careful that way too, to not say this is what it means, because I live in 2020 and you know, my world's very different from Anne's. So yeah, I'm afraid your guess is as good as mine there. I tried to leave the signposts, and it's really up to people to read it themselves and try and understand it themselves, I think. Yeah. It's a hard one, that one.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, well, I think that is all of our questions, unless I missed any last second ones. I don't see any more. So I guess we will wrap up. Thank you so much for talking with us, Dannielle. It's been such a pleasure hearing from you. It's been a lot of really interesting information. I definitely found it very informative. Hopefully everyone else did as well. And just so you know, we do have transcriptions of some of Anne and Mrs. Barlow's trip around Italy, so I can get you some links for that.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
I'd love to see how. I just love to read that bit. I never got the chance.
Yeah, we can get that to you.
Thanks, Jenna. And
Yeah.
just before we all leave, I'd just like to say well done, Summit folks. You know, I hope they're an amazing feat of organisation, and well done. And I'm sure everyone who's come along to any of the sessions will really remember it for a long time. So, you know, good job.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us, and enjoy day 2 of the summit.